I'm going to read, I'm not going to go off-piste in case I meet a wolf. So this is an kind of extended version of a paper I gave in Paris earlier this year. And what I want to outline here is a research project which is still very much in its infancy, which I'm still in the process of articulating and configuring as a pilot scheme. And it broadly involves, as Erica pointed out, an exploration of the creative potential of digital writing practice in the context of mental health and well-being. Because of the stage it's at, what I'm presenting here is not a set of post hoc findings, but rather a set of questions which I'm hoping the research project will address. These are questions which cover a number of discursive fields, but are rooted in the creative practice of digital machines in a very broad sense of the term, as well as the creative practice of their users. In that sense, I feel the project is well aligned with the interests and questions of the conference, which I will return to at the end. So let me begin by explaining the sort of digital / mental health background. My own background as a creative practitioner, researcher and teacher is in performance writing, and more specifically, again, as Erica said, in the relationship between digital writing and performativity. For me, digital writing is a paradigm of performance writing, as performativity forms a red thread which runs through the whole digital assemblage from the hardware of the machine via the code to the human-computer interface and the screen, and into the three-dimensional space beyond the screen in which the digital text performs in its own right or in combination with the body. Given this background, I've recently been working with a speech and language therapist at a charity in Ivybridge in Devon, which is in the southwest, which specialises in the care of people who are dependent on what are known as augmentative and alternative communication devices. These digital machines are typically used by people with severe cognitive or physical impairment. This impairment may have resulted from an innate medical condition, such as cerebral palsy, or perhaps brain damage as a result of traumatic accident or a stroke, for example. AAC devices range from spelling panels, literally digital machines in the sense that they are activated with the pointing finger, to eye-tracking digital devices which can spell out written language on a screen and or transform written language into speech. These devices feature in the public consciousness mainly through high-profile users such as Stephen Hawking, or via high-profile outcomes such as Jean-Dominique Bauby's The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which is a best-selling memoir later made into a film. There has also been media interest in such users as Jonathan Bryan, a young poet and blogger who suffered severe brain damage at birth and whose progress has been described as nothing short of a miracle. So it may be worth looking at these instances of AAC use in turn, as they raise, I think, certain issues about how these digital machines might be deployed in creative practice. Okay. No, it's okay, so. Have we got?
Yeah, normally it should work.
Sound. It doesn't. It just needs a little bit. That's fine. Actually, it doesn't. I think we're probably all quite familiar with this.
But it's written there.
I lost my cursor.
That's because I know it.
Distant galaxies were moving away from us. This meant they must have.
Okay, so I think we're all actually quite familiar with this. We've all seen those kinds of images of Hawking using this machine. One of the misconceptions, of course, is that he's using this machine in real time, constructing fully grammatical sentences on the fly and broadcasting them through a vocal system. This isn't the case. The eye tracking system that many AAC users deploy is lengthy and exhausting to use. Any questions put to Hawking will have been sent to him weeks before, so that he has time to construct responses. In other words, these machines impose a different sort of temporality on the communication process. There is a mismatch between the temporality of the composition and that of the performance. The temporality of the user is often ignored or effaced in public performances such as this. Indeed, it's tempting to wonder if the digital writing speaking device might have impacted in some way on Hawking's thinking about the nature of time. The question of temporality also arises in the story of Jean-Dominique Bauby. And his the French journalist and author. As a result of a massive stroke, Bauby lost all movement throughout his body except for his left eye. His condition is commonly referred to as Lockedin syndrome. He communicated by blinking one eye to select one letter at a time from a revised alphabet to spell out words. The alphabetic list was repeated over and over again by his speech therapist, and she wrote down each letter that he selected and constructed words and sentences. Although not an electronic device, there is an argument to be made that Bauby and his therapist constitute a digital device, especially in the terms laid out by Anthony Wilden in his essay on the digital and analog computer in System and Structure. For Wilden, the difference between the digital and the analog is one of the difference between the discrete, either or, and the continuous, and. On this reckoning, a cog or a governor flywheel, for example, are digital devices. Effectively, one could argue that the blinking eye constitutes a binary device. It is open or shut, and could be said to operate in the same way that any punch card system operates in a digital device or a Jacquard loom. The role of the therapist in this case is purely mechanical. As with Hawking, the question of temporality arises again here. The outcome of Bauby's digital writing process is a print book, which in itself exists out of the time of composition. The sheer length and difficulty of Bauby's compositional process is not visible within the book. In effect, the time of the composition process decomposes in the final outcome. Furthermore, not knowing how the book was composed would inevitably influence any reading of it. This is a very neat illustration of Catherine Hale's distinction between the time of production in print culture and the time of performance in digital literary culture. Something I'll return to in due course. Another example similar to that of Bauby is provided by Jonathan Bryan. 11-year-old Bryan has gained much interest in the media for his remarkable ability to write poetry and fiction, keep a regular blog, and communicate with his parents, in spite of his severe and debilitating cerebral palsy. He is an example of what patients who are locked in, fully cogent but unable to communicate, are apparently capable of achieving. I Can Write, a memoir of a child's silent soul emerging, is the title of his autobiography. I in that title is spelled E-Y-E. The sentimentality of the book title should alert us to hyperbole, and there are questions over the way in which digital machines are deployed in these contexts, something which particularly emerges in the case of Rom Houben. Houben was hailed by Belgian neurologists Stephen Lowrys, head of the Coma Science Group at Liège University Hospital, for his ability to type out his thoughts on a keypad via the help of his facilitator, Linda Wouters, despite having been in a coma for 23 years and assumed to be non-communicative. Sorry, I lost my cursor again. Was it there? Oh, okay.
Of course.
Do you need the sound there?
No, not really. What's interesting is the kind of the gestures being used by the facilitator in this context. It just gives you a sense certainly of how these machines work and the relationship between the two. Okay. As you can see from the video clip, Wouters interpreted subtle movements from Houben's right hand to guide his fingers to the desired letters in a case that attracted international attention. As you can see from the video clip, this is deeply problematic. It's a technique referred to as facilitated communication, or FC, a method for assisting a non-verbal person in communicating, where a facilitator or carer is guided to make a choice of letters or words via small physical signals from a patient. However, controlled research using single and double-blind procedures in laboratory and natural settings has determined not only that the people with disabilities are unable to respond accurately to label or describe stimuli unseen by their assistants, but also that the responses are controlled by the assistants. In short, the messages were coming not from the patients, but from the facilitators who were, in inverted commas, interpreting which letter or word was being indicated. So I just need to turn this off. If I can find it. Most importantly, facilitated communication can be done entirely accidentally, with no need for malice or harmful intent. Often good intentions and a deep desire for contact leads the facilitator to spell out the messages themselves without even realizing, convincing themselves that they are in fact
The video is running in the background.
We're being facilitated.
Yeah.
Stick of the sun, maybe.
So let me close this and get rid of the. I hate YouTube. Right. So in the case of facilitated communication, the human digital assemblage could be described as a digital machine in the same way that as Bobby and his therapist. It's just that the generator of the text is not who you think it is. There is a parallel here with something like the Ouija board or the Japanese Bunraku puppet, the figure who is manipulated in plain view. What I'm not doing here, however, is making out any sort of moral or ethical case. What emerges from these particular case studies of AAC users and writing practice is that first, and self-evidently, the devices they use do not consist solely of technological machines. The machine, in this case, necessarily entails other components or agents, i.e. the carers. In other words, very little of the whole assemblage is actually digital in the sort of common parlance understanding of digital. And much of it requires the performance of warm bodies with often unknowable and sometimes contradictory agendas. Some of those contradictory agendas revolve around temporality. As stated above, the AAC device user produces language very slowly, or rather at their own speed. The carer often wants, consciously or unconsciously, to impose a normal speed of communication on the user. This results in techniques for second-guessing what the AAC user wants to say, based on what has already been said, like a sort of human Markov chain, which I think to a certain extent ties in with what Richard was talking about earlier. This is particularly true of everyday instrumental communication. The effect is often to disempower the AAC user by constant interruption with a view to preempting their desires. There are good reasons for this, and the users may well be deeply grateful that they are spared the intense effort of having to spell out their desires or requests in full. But it does raise interesting broader questions on the dromology of writing, to adopt Virilio's term. I'd like to make a couple of general points here, one related to a theory of communication and the other to creative practice. The notion of facilitated communication has been set up as something of a straw man, I think, here. It is, from one point of view, suspect as a practice. It's often described as illicit and disempowering, however well-intentioned. But isn't all communication, especially creative writing in practice, facilitated? How can it not be? Isn't every reader or listener a carer, busy preempting and interpreting or creating meaning because meaning does not inhere in language so much as in the context from which language emerges, or rather within which it is performed? By the same token, isn't every writer's hand metaphorically being held not by one, but by myriad other hands, pointing to particular words and sentences? To talk of unfacilitated communication is to fall into the myth of the sole begetter of an original text, or the idea of the encoding-decoding model of communication, where the medium, language, is totally transparent and without context. The first point above is especially pertinent to an aspect of the creative output that might emerge from this research project, which is what I want to turn to now. Having given a sense of some of the questions and research areas which might emerge from an engagement with AAC digital devices, I want to narrow the focus to how I want to use creative practice as a research tool in this context, and more importantly, how that creative practice might be characterized. In terms of creative practice, AAC users are often expected to conform to culturally valued genres and modes of writing, such as the story or the poem, all of which are effectively print-based models located within the context of the literary. Hence, Bobby's published memoir and Brian's stories, blogs and poems. Or in another case I heard of, a theatre director was brought in to produce a sawn-off version of Macbeth with a group of AAC users. Can you imagine? The background to my particular research project then is a perceived dissatisfaction with the ways in which various creative writing practices are applied to the users of AAC. So to reiterate briefly the aim of the project that I outlined at the beginning, the above is a background against which I aim to investigate what mental health / well-being benefits might accrue to AAC users from the deployment of their digital writing machines in a creative context as opposed to everyday communication context. This question brought in its wake two others. Firstly, what might creative digital writing practice with AAC devices look like? And secondly, how might we measure the mental health benefits, if indeed there are any? And the second of these questions is beyond the scope of this paper, so I'm going to concentrate on the first. In researching previous creative projects which have been developed in this area for AAC users, there is a tendency for the proposed outcome of such projects, often print-based, to be given in advance. In other words, the endpoint is decided upon from the outset, and the creative enterprise then is to arrive at that endpoint. The same is true of, for example, the performance of an existing script, like the Mac example. There is always a teleology. This allows for evaluation of the extent to which the project succeeds or fails. What this approach, which is fundamentally a creative writing approach, fails to examine is process, just as the output of Bobby, Bryan and Hawking mask the writing composition process in favour of achieving a normative, culturally recognisable output. So the first step then in designing this research project is to adopt a different strategy, one that foregrounds the digital process, creative uncertainty, performance, and more specifically improvised performance. And in this instance, I'm suggesting a performance writing approach, which is an area I've operated in for quite some time now. And as an aside, before I outline its lineaments, part of the argument for a performance writing approach stemmed from two moments in the preliminary search, in my preliminary research of the Hannah Rogers charity. The first was a conversation with the head speech and language therapist. I asked her what their clients, their AAC clients, did when they wanted to swear at their carers. Do they have a panel for that? Do they have a panel of swear words? She said they didn't, and assumed that they would have to spell out an obscenity and then have the machine pronounce it, which kind of undermines the whole notion of the point of using swear words. For me, this was a moment of insight into the extent to which aspects of language behaviour are constrained by the affordances of these digital devices. The second moment was an encounter with a young man who at one point began repeatedly pressing the needs key on his panel, causing the machine to voice this word over and over again. The apparent urgency of the voice caused all sorts of anxiety in the listeners and carers, who started offering a stream of interpretations about what might be being requested. At the same time, the young man had a broad grin on his face. It occurred to me that this might not be a request at all, nor a demand. He might have no communicational value at all. There were two other possibilities at work here. Firstly, that he was simply taking delight in playing with the machine, making it perform, enjoying the sonic quality of the word, irrespective of its meaning. The other possibility, that he was just enjoying winding up his carers with this communication which wasn't a communication, and exercising clawing back control. Bearing these thoughts in mind, I want to outline the main characteristics of performance writing with a view to showing how much, in my opinion, how much better suited it might be to a practice-based research project like this. So this is just a series of headings, basically, which are kind of outlining a general sense of what this approach might look like. One, language as an event, not an object. An important premise of performance writing is that language is an event, not an object. The only point at which anything can be said about language is at the moment when it emerges into the world in a material form as visual marks or articulated breath. Texts are viewed as radically incomplete, even in print, and capable of continual reperformance. This is somewhat different to a traditional creative writing / literary approach, which starts from a pre-existing mode or text. Another basic premise of performance writing is that linguistic meaning is only established at the moment of its instantiation, of its performance, even in the case of a printed text. It doesn't exist prior to this, because a major determinant of meaning is context. There is no text without a context, and this is part and parcel of the performance, the performative environment. As an aside, I think there's an implicit questioning of the notion of locked in here, as in locked-in syndrome. This syndrome might presuppose that language exists in some sort of interior space alongside the imagination, that it gives shape or substance to the imagination and then is transmitted to the outside via a series of marks or sounds. This may also be a model lurking behind the idea of a mediatized machine, that the machine mediates between internal imaginative content and external form. Here we are working with a different notion, that of the machine being an integral part of the construction of an imaginative performance of language. Performance writing emphasizes the interrogation of practices rather than the acceptance of pre-existing solutions or models. The basis of a performance writing approach is not we know how to write and we'll show you how to do it, but rather what text did you, with your uneasy and difficult relationship with language, want to produce. And there are AAC users are a dramatic example to me of people with a very uneasy and difficult relationship with language. But then we all have an uneasy and difficult relationship with language, which I think has been shown by this morning. This insistence, emphasis on process, not product, tends to prioritize process over product and allows for the idea of writing as performance rather than simply writing for performance. This is an important element, as mentioned above, in that the performative nature of this writing mode means that the temporality of the AAC device uses is not only restored, but it is given preeminence. The process-driven approach effectively becomes an exercise in slow writing. In other words, the temporality of the composition, of the compositional process, is handed back to the user rather than to the interpreter. In relation to digital writing machines, this makes absolute sense. Performativity, as I said, is the red thread that runs through the digital assemblage. From the hardware, the executability of the code, the gestures of the user and the carer, to the textual display on a series of screens and platforms and in different venues. As many have argued, digital writing is not an object like a codex, but an eventalized text. Once the idea of digital writing as a complex interaction of elements is taken on board, the idea that all writing is collaborative becomes central. And as we have seen above, collaborative writing is not only a central element of the AAC process, it can be highly problematic for AAC users where facilitated communication creeps in. With regard to my proposed project, there is a difference. What I have in mind is a collaboration between the device users. They will be writing collectively. The carer facilitator as a figure or position in this communication model could be largely removed if that's what the participant wants. Once the idea of a collaborative writing project is proposed, this introduces two new developments for the research. Firstly, there is the idea that abled writers using AAC devices might participate in some form as a way of gaining insight into and contributing to the discussion around the creative potential of these machines. In particular, it would allow them to experience this notion of slow writing, putting themselves in an ironically disabled position, using digital technology which defines itself by speed and ease of access. This needs to be carefully considered, however, to avoid an oversimplified sense of understanding disability. The sort of notion that you can understand what it's like to be blind, what it is to be blind, by walking around for a day with your eyes closed. Secondly, as there are a number of AAC users, device users who are restricted to their homes, a networked performance can be developed with satellite performers inputting remotely into the main live event. This may prove to be one effective way of combating the sense of isolation which many housebound device users feel. So where does this take us? If the above, what are we doing for time? All right. If the above is the set of principles that a performance might be based on, what might the performance itself look like? At the moment, the research proposal consists initially of an exploration of the affordances of AAC devices. What are they capable of? What are they incapable of in the performative terms? How might they be developed or modified for a performance context? This will be followed up by a series of devised workshops with the participation of AAC users in which we will explore these affordances in a performative writing setting. Hopefully this will culminate in a collaborative writing performance involving projected text, image and sound in a specific space or site with a mixture of abled and disabled participants and networked with other AAC users outside the space. Actually, one of the kind of models that it's different but is similar is actually Annie Abrams and Emmanuel Guez's The Reading Club, that notion of both a collection of writers in a particular space but also networked outside that space, producing a kind of collaborative writing project which is then accessed by a live audience or indeed by later through a video of the performance, etc. What I would be interested in is kind of expanding that model to a certain extent to involve also projection of image and also broadcast of spoken voice as well. And one aspect which hasn't been touched on so far is that of voice. What a performance allows for is not only the display of projected written text, but also the performance of voice. Many AAC users have limited or no natural vocal capacity and rely on their devices to speak for them. Of course, the characteristics of voice are closely related to our notions of identity, even though we don't hear our own voice as others hear it. There is malleability here. Stephen Hawking was famously asked if he wanted to exchange his self-evidently digital voice for one which more closely resembled his own voice, and he said no, on the grounds that his digital voice now was recognisably his own voice. There have been some interesting recent developments in this area in relation to synthetic voice and voice reconstruction, which I think John might have, has been kind of working with and working on. For instance, if somebody knows that a medical or neurological condition will result in them losing their voice, then a company like Vocalid can create an artificial representation of their voice before the loss takes place. I'm going to try. No, that's not going to work. Let's see if we can find this. So this is the Vocalid, Vocal ID, whatever they call themselves, website, which effectively reconstructs, synthesizes voice, which can be used both in a kind of commercial, corporate context, or indeed in kind of there's quite an interesting quote here, which I kind of picked up. Which is, in fact, the results of this kind of reconstruction of an original voice, whatever that might be, have been unconvincing, and there are interesting presuppositions behind this kind of Vocalid approach. As their website states, our founder, Rupal Patel, explained at TEDWin in 2013, we wouldn't dream of fitting a young girl with the prosthetic limb of a grown man, so why the same prosthetic voice? Well, why not? Why not provide for multivocality? And one possible fruitful area, I think, of exploration in this performance is how AAC users might escape the confines of univocality and become legion, in Walt Whitman's terms. This is perhaps the key point of connection with the concerns of the conference. The resonances with the Annie Abrams epigraph to the conference call it clear. Quote, I speak with a voice that's not my own. I speak in other voices, not my voice. Over and above this, another phrase which leapt out for me from the conference call refers to playing with and performing, quote, linguistic complexity and fluidity, both across human languages and between human and machine languages, all the while guarding against, quote, the dangers of linguistic standardization seeking to suppress hybridity. I feel that the project outlined here enjoys some significant shared interests, creative, theoretical, political, with the overarching concerns of the language internetworks conference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerome, and also for this nice round of linking it to the conference topic. Anyone questions? Yes, Richard.
I just enjoyed it, actually. It does resonate with my own ways of exploring these sorts of spaces, and sort of things that I find very interesting is one of the things which was mentioned this morning was that text has a linearity to it. And one of the things I tried to explore when I worked with mobile phone manufacturer was to say that the reason why people like to send text is because you can text, you can time travel, you can go back to the beginning of what you said and change it, or you can insert in a moment and flatten it out. Whereas when you speak in vivo, you can't undo times error,
No.
and you can't undo what you have said.
No.
And that's because the genius of the written word is you can play with time. But I was trying to suggest with lots of different dimensions to it. So the dimension of voice is not just uniqueness. There's a new aesthetic that's afforded in beautiful voices. So I might say that failing British prime ministers don't have as beautiful voices as successful British prime ministers, for example. I'm trying to be mischievous here.
Yeah,
There's lots of dimensions which can be thought of as affordances which are enabled, and which can be explored through these sorts of research endeavours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's certainly something which I think is worth exploring, and again, moving away from this kind of notion of univocality and an authentic voice. I think they use the word authentic, right? As if one has an authentic voice. I mean, my voice kind of shifts and changes quite often to the context I'm operating in, the language I'm operating in, that sort of thing. And I think to focus in simply on a notion of an authentic voice kind of makes no sense. Why not go to the opposite extreme and provide the possibility that somebody could talk like a 16-year-old girl in the morning and an 85-year-old man in the afternoon, which I think would be in many ways, from a performative point of view, far more interesting than somebody, say, thinking, I'm now performing in my own voice. And of course it doesn't happen like that, because actually what you're doing if you're typing something out and then you play it back through a machine, and then you're listening to it. You're listening to it differently than you listen to it when you speak in your head. I mean, the vibrations go via a different route. So it's not even as if you're listening to something different to the authentic voice, again, whatever that might be. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I understood properly what Richard previously said when he grabbed Hitler's book, but maybe we could somehow connect this now, because he talks about Edison's voice in the recording, the gramophone being a ghost voice. Prosthetic limb reminds me of ghost limbs.
Yes.
So a prosthetic voice could lead somehow to a ghost voice.
That's
what would
interesting.
that be? And I'm sure that you are aware of Keeper's theatralization with how Edison recorded his voice in the gramophone, and wondered about how that would be a ghost voice.
Yeah, yeah. Which ties in with that whole area kind of around haunted media and that notion.
Ghost in the machine.
Yeah. But also, I mean, early wireless developers who were convinced, some of whom were convinced that the wireless constituted a portal to the next world, and one could communicate with the dead via this technology, which is interesting.
John, you have a question?
I was just wondering how you deal with the question of voice and mediated linguistic performance with respect, things that brought up by vocal ID, with the current developments of identity thought. In other words, it seems that if one can take a position where one is questioning the authentic, that identity should be treated as something that we can be creative about, or that is not fixed.
Yeah.
And then there are clearly these days, and I'm not saying just these days, there are clearly issues concerning aspects of identity that are off that menu.
Yes.
Right. The example I'm thinking of is the first genderless voice, Q,
Yeah.
where you can, but the first genderless voice is nonetheless middle class, clearly white,
Yes.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you had thoughts with respect to this area.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. I was listening on the radio. There was a radio dramatisation recently of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. And of course, in Orlando famously changes gender kind of halfway through the book. And this radio dramatisation of it was the character of Orlando was spoken by a trans actor. But if you didn't know that, you would just assume that it was a male actor, because the voice was absolutely a male voice. And you couldn't say, oh, no, I would defy many people to have said that's a trans actor. They would assume that it was simply a male actor. Which is interesting. I mean, I think we have so many kind of preconceptions about it. I mean, it's about reading stuff into the nature of voice and its relationship to identity all the time. What I suppose what I would be interested in terms of this, the performance is not solving that problem, so to speak, if one thinks of it as a problem, but as it were, simply creating a space in which that sort of multivocality might play out, and in which it is actually precisely extremely difficult for the audience to know who's writing which. Is this text being produced by an abled writer or a disabled writer? Is this text being said by, a gender? What's the gender of the person saying this text, or the machine that is saying the text for this person? Just as it were, creating a space in which those kinds of questions don't get they don't get resolved, but they do get aired. You see what I mean?
Yes,
there are some interesting examples about multivocality in Beckett's plays. Not for example, where the mouth is shown only and there's a flow, and obviously is conceptualized because the person saying the words is constantly saying it's not me, I'm not, it's not me that speaks. And also in the other play, Perhaps Last Day, where he actually listens to himself as he grows older and to his young self, and so the multi-voice is represented both as this functional sort of identity kind of issue, but also as we grow into different identities as we grow into different contexts, or we grow older, whatever.
Yeah, that's a nice link. I mean, one of the interesting things about written language, which maybe hasn't been raised, is the extent to which it is gendered. Can one, if you project a typed text onto a screen, then there probably are all sorts of markers which may point you in the direction of the gender of the writer, but it's not gendered in the same way that the moment that gets articulated as voice is gendered.
Just an aside on Beckett, the estate is famous for not allowing female productions of things like Waiting for Godot. You're not allowed to do it unless except as a transgression.
What about Not I? Because I've only ever seen Not I performed by women.
True. But I don't know.
It's illegal. I mean, they will not allow. I mean, officially they say they will never allow. The state, the Beckett estate will never allow that because Beckett was against it.
That it has to be performed by a woman.
It has, but unofficially or somehow under a different title.
Yeah. Interesting.
Like an adaptation.
Yeah.
The last note or question about that as well. You were speaking about the temporality of the voice as it comes through the machine and all that. And I'm just wondering to what extent that might actually change the ontology of that language, or in John's sense, perhaps even removes the languageness of that language precisely because of that distance in time and the fact that it, in a way, it becomes writing because it has to pass through that process that removes the immediacy between the voice and the language in the head in a way. So in a way, it's closer perhaps to writing in the traditional sense of writing as to speaking.
Yeah, I mean, just I think in a way that's there to be explored. You know, how does that affect a reading? If text is emerging very slowly, how does that, and to what extent does the audience then put itself in the same kind of position as the carer is to the user, a constant kind of second guessing of what is going to emerge? And I think we do that all the time, which I think was quite interesting. Coming back to what Richard was talking about earlier, the notion of predictive text. I mean, because I think you were making a distinction, or it seemed to be making a distinction between likelihood and understanding. And I just wonder if that is a clear distinction, or whether actually what we do all the time is create a kind of a dynamic of likelihood, that actually, you know, that you are sitting here trying to work out what is going to be said next, and what the likelihood is of the words that I'm using meaning that particular, because of the basic ambiguity and indeterminacy of language, that you always have to be, at every moment, be making interpretations about and mapping language on mapping meaning into language.
I think if you do conversational analysis, I just published a book on Skype. It's called Skype in the Family, where we look at what people, how in talk and through Skype they cross-refer to prior terms and then project future terms to demonstrate that they're making some inferences. They kind of, you probably mean this, but they don't say, when the partner says, I love you, they don't say, do you probably mean that? And they don't expect the person listening to think, shall I make a probability guess? Rather, you think, they're saying I love you for a purpose. And it's not quite clear what the purpose is. Are they now going to say they've done something terrible?
Yeah.
Or are they going to say, oh, they're going to propose something sweet?
Yeah.
And so the likelihood, they're using likelihood to understand the deities, but they show how they use likelihood is in the things they say and do. So when someone starts, you know, if I go home to my partner tonight and I walk in and I say I love you, the first thing she's going to think is, what's going on?
It's one of the interesting things that, again, coming back to swearing and the in effect taking that capacity away from these users, because swearing is, I mean, I get with first year students looking at sight and context, one of the things I get them to do is define what the phrase fuck off means. And of course they can't. Well, they come up with some ludicrous kind of explanation or meaning attributing to that phrase, but then you can find myriad contextual or the myriad context, in which case it doesn't mean that at all. It can mean something completely different. And I think there is always, I think it's one of the reasons why I think this kind of performance writing insistence on context, understanding consistency, which also actually comes back to what John was talking about earlier about integrational linguistics, which absolutely insists on the preeminence of the social, the preeminence of and the primordiality of context is very important. It doesn't, and it's different from a kind of philosophy of language approach, which says language has meaning and context simply adjusts that meaning. There's a difference between that and saying, actually, we don't know what anything means until we know what context it's being used in.
Yeah, there's a third nuance there. You could say we live in language, which is what Wittgenstein would say. And by saying it's in and through our ways of articulating and sharing our affairs that we come to constitute those affairs. So it's not just languages separate, or the languages constituted those. There is the more nuanced way of doing it. And if you're inside language, then one of the paradoxes of, say some original interpretations of language is that if you're on the inside of it, it's difficult to be confronted with it elsewhere.
John,
just a couple of. This is just a suggestion that if you think of emojis, to go back to emojis, that they function a bit like an AAC. And as an example of of what I do with emojis is where I type it into the text messaging system and then see if there's an emoji that corresponds to the word. And if you type in swear words, most of them are not available.
Yeah.
And there's so much that is not available.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And then another thing, I just want to read you this quote. This is from Lucy Ives, who's a poet. Writing is about putting oneself in a constrained position from which there are limited means of escape. One must possess only the ability to tolerate a given position long enough to make it intelligible to others.
Yeah.
Which I take to be, we're setting out on a Bayesian, I'm starting a sentence and I'm going to try and make this intelligible, but I'm not sure whether I'm really going to make it. And I just keep, and the proof of writing is that I keep going until I think you've understood.
No, absolutely. Yeah, any utterance is an act of optimism, in that sense.
It's a nice conclusion.
Somehow that the sort of the Bayesian model of language gets collapsed at a certain point if there's a real voice, or if there's voice.
Thanks a lot, Jerome.